suggestion is that this House do now adjourn. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to have secured a debate on this very important issue following my early day motion number 223, calling time on nuisance calls, lodged at the end of June, which attracted support from members across this House. I'm also pleased that so many members have turned up and will stay to attend this debate so late in the evening, an indication, Mr Speaker, if any were needed, that this is an issue which affects constituents in every part of the United Kingdom. For my part, very quickly after the election, I had a number of constituents from North Ayrshire and Arran raise this matter with me in exasperation and despair that they were unable to find peace and quiet in their own homes due to the constant torrent of nuisance calls at all hours of the day and evening. And there are three such types, of course: live marketing calls, recorded marketing calls and abandoned silent calls. Do you want a conservatory? Would you like to save money on your gas, electricity, broadband, credit card, etc.? Have you had an accident in the last number of X years? Have you claimed PPI to which you are entitled? Would you like to take out a convenient loan? The list goes on and on. But we know that such calls, as well as being a nuisance, are much more than that. They cause real distress and anxiety and upset, particularly to the elderly and the vulnerable, who simply cannot ignore their ringing phone, because often it's the single most important means of friends and family keeping in touch with them. Of course they will.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and very clearly this is an issue that transcends across all parties, across all regions as well. And my own constituency of Stratford over the last few months, the numbers of phone calls of those who are vulnerable, who are elderly, who are young people as well, and those who are educationally disadvantaged. Those four categories of people have been taken advantage of, and not only are they getting nuisance phone calls, they're losing money. Does the Honourable Lady feel that legislation needs to be put in place to ensure that those vulnerable people are not losing money to these scams that are happening across the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
The Honourable Gentleman makes a very important point, because what I was going to come on to later on in my speech is the fact that we know that how our data is used and passed on leaves the consumer without any real control, and there is evidence, studies have shown there is evidence to suggest that there are certain groups in society who are deliberately targeted. Research undertaken by Which tells us that 8 out of 10 people said that cold calls were an annoying feature of their daily lives, with a worrying 1/3 admitting they found such calls intimidating, with 56%, more than half, saying they were discouraged from answering their phones. Make no mistake, the scale of this problem is huge, and the effect on the lives of many of our constituents demands our attention. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I congratulate her on securing this adjournment debate. Many of these calls that affect all of our constituents up and down the country actually originate from abroad. Does she have any idea as to how we can bear down on such nuisance calls from companies outside of this country, in addition to in this country as well?
Certainly there is talk and cooperation, and Ofcom have been leading the way on this and looking at what can be done at European level. Beyond that, at an international level, I think it's a case of knocking heads together and seeing how we can better regulate and control the data which leaves this country. Registering with the Telephone Preference Service, or the TPS, is the obvious first step for those who feel their lives are blighted by nuisance calls. However, while this is an important tool, this service cannot stop all unsolicited calls. And it's estimated by Ofcom. I will indeed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the lady agree that this is an issue that particularly affects many older people? I know that my constituency, Postbag, is full of older people concerned about nuisance calls.
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. Old people in particular not only suffer more anxiety and distress about this, but they seem to be targeted, and the research would seem to bear this out. It's estimated by Ofcom that the TPS service can only stop around 1/3 of nuisance calls, and this is because the issue of consent can be very confusing for consumers, and it's not always clear that they have given their consent for their data to be passed on to other parties by ticking or not ticking a box on a form. In addition, could I just make some progress on this point, if you will? In addition, there's often a lack of clarity over the sheer range of other parties that may have agreed for their data to be shared with. As a result, those who register with TPS may still be subject to a barrage of nuisance calls. But perhaps most worrying, the evidence from Step Change, the debt charity, is truly, truly chilling. 1 in 3 of their service users, people who are in severe financial difficulty, has received an unsolicited marketing call offering a payday loan. It is absolutely shocking that unsolicited marketing calls for high-risk credit are encouraging financially vulnerable households deeper into the spiral of problem debt. Before seeking advice, 15% of people said that they went on to take out further loans, borrowing an average of £980, and that's not all. People who have already taken out a payday loan are significantly more likely to be targeted by nuisance calls or texts for payday loans. According to a report by the Children's Society, 42% of people with a payday loan are contacted at least once a day, in contrast to only 11% of those who do not have a payday loan. And chillingly, over 1 million British adults say they have been tempted to take out high-interest credit, such as a payday loan, as a direct result of an unsolicited marketing call or text. And I would urge the Minister to use his influence to persuade the Financial Conduct Authority to bring forward stronger rules to tackle the unsolicited marketing of high-risk credit products like payday loans. More must be done. Following the Government's action plan and the subsequent which-led task force, which reported in December 2014, a series of recommendations for government, regulators and businesses focused on finding solutions that work within the existing legislative structure. This includes director-level responsibility and also requiring businesses to show their numbers when they call. Ofcom wants all communication providers to stop charging for caller line identification display. Only BT and Virgin now do so, but it is hoped that this can be secured from all providers through the forthcoming EU framework review. Businesses need to make public commitments to tackling nuisance calls, and it's also important that consumers have much greater control over their personal data. Indeed, it is essential that if and when consumers give their consent to be contacted by companies, that it is clear to the consumer that he or she is doing so, and further, that it is easy for the consumer to revoke that consent should they wish to.
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's making a very compelling speech on this subject. Does the Honourable Lady agree with me that it would be very helpful indeed if every time someone made such a call as this, they were required to state exactly how they had come by that information and on what basis they were relying on the consent of the person who they were ringing?
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes an excellent point, and one I think the Minister would do well to pay much attention to. Consumers are often targeted by nuisance calls because at some point they ticked the box, or more commonly, failed to tick the box. A teeny, tiny wee box at the bottom of a page of tiny writing, which often the consumer doesn't even see. And this gives consent to companies to contact them by telephone and pass on their personal details to third parties. And of course, as has already been mentioned, let's not forget scam calls, where the goal is to defraud consumers. Work done by some local authorities suggests that as many as 15% of nuisance calls to vulnerable customers are in fact scam calls. Another sign that the consumer has very little control over their personal data, and who knows where it can land as it passes through hands that are not always scrupulous.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would she also agree with me that it's not only older adults who may be at risk, but also vulnerable people who have mental health problems or learning difficulties who may be targeted by these unscrupulous callers.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a whole range of people in society who need the protection of the law and tighter regulation in this area. And mobile phone users have not escaped this plague. In fact, many mobile phone users are simply not aware that they can register their mobile with the TPS, and only 3% have done so. My own local authority, North Ayrshire Council, is doing some excellent work to help protect vulnerable consumers. It has invested in 10 call blockers, and out of 32 local authorities in Scotland, it blocks the third highest number of calls. The call blocking device ensures that only trusted sources can get through and stops nuisance callers in their tracks before the residents' phones have even had the chance to ring. One consumer has had just over 2,000 calls blocked in a 4-month period. Whilst this is to be applauded, it is a disgrace that any one household would be subjected to such a barrage of nuisance calls. Very briefly.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. For automated messages, she'll be aware that one can often press 9 to remove oneself from a list. Does she agree with me that telling a cold caller to remove you from the list should be enough for them not to call you anymore?
Absolutely, absolutely. The difficulty, though, is that your personal data is out there among a whole host of organisations who will further continue to pester you. It's essential that the government needs to look again at whether the rules around how our data is collected, used and traded needs to be tightened. We must get the balance right between enabling decent businesses to carry out direct marketing activity where consumers have given their consent for their personal data to be used, and preventing the abuse of their data by unscrupulous businesses. I would also urge the Government to lead a cross-sector business awareness campaign to ensure that companies know their responsibilities when it comes to marketing calls and texts, and consider how future legislation could tackle nuisance marketing.
Would the honourable member give way?
Very briefly. For the
in terms of influence to the Minister, my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire Namlet, recognise the impact that the charitable sector has in terms of its cold calling and the impact it has in their communities. And those discussions should include also the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, as well as the Charity Commission for England and Wales and Northern Ireland, to make sure charities recognise their care of duty to the vulnerable and the elderly.
The gentleman makes an excellent point. This should include all organisations who may choose to use cold calling as one of their tools. Senior executives need to be made more responsible for the actions of their companies. Whilst the Government has committed funding to an awareness campaign, more action is required, and there is, in my view, an important role here for the Financial Conduct Authority. It's time that the responsibility for this was no longer placed so heavily on the victims of nuisance calls, and businesses who engage in this practice should be held more accountable for the genuine distress and anxiety they cause to consumers.
To reply to the debate, I call the Minister, Ed Vasey.
Well, I'm very grateful